What would you do if the entire world looked at you and saw nothing but the personification of hope, while inside you felt only the crushing gravity of solitude? It is a paradox that few will ever truly grasp. When your face is plastered on posters with the word hope in bold block letters, you cease to be a man and begin to be a monument. But monuments are cold, and they stand alone in the wind. This is not a conventional story about a winner. The world has seen enough of the cheering crowds at Grant Park and the historic inaugurations. Instead, this is a chronicle of a human being who mastered the agonizing art of smiling while carrying the expectations of 8 billion souls on his shoulders. Welcome to the untold shadows of Barack Obama's journey, the quiet, hollow spaces behind the grandeur of the most powerful office on earth. To understand the weight Obama carried, one must first look at the unique architecture of his life. From his earliest days in Hawaii, he lived in the in-between. Born to a Kenyan father he barely knew and a white Kansan mother, he was a bridge between worlds that often refused to meet. While the public narrative paints this as a foundational strength for a future unifier, the private reality was often one of profound isolation. Imagine being the only person in every room who truly understands the complexity of your own identity. As he climbed the rungs of elite academia at Columbia and Harvard, he wasn't just fighting for grades. He was fighting for a sense of belonging in institutions that weren't built for people who looked like him. Every time he raised his hand in a lecture hall, it wasn't just a question. It was a demand for recognition. But when the lights went out in those dorm rooms, the question remained: if I fall, who will catch a man who belongs to everyone and no one at the same time? The public remembers November 4th, 2008 as a night of pure, unadulterated triumph. They see the "Yes, we can" banners and the tears of joy. But let us step behind the velvet curtain of the stage. In those final seconds before stepping out to greet the ocean of people in Chicago, Obama stood in a pocket of absolute silence. In that breath, the glory vanished. What replaced it was a realization that would haunt the next 8 years. He was no longer a person with the right to be flawed. He had become a symbol. Symbols aren't allowed to be tired. Symbols aren't allowed to be angry. Symbols aren't allowed to doubt. By accepting the crown of hope, he inadvertently signed away his right to be human. The world gave him the presidency, but in exchange, it took his freedom to be weak. As he walked toward the podium, he performed the ultimate act of discipline. He adjusted his tie, straightened his back, and wore a smile that felt as heavy as lead. He didn't just win an election that night. He accepted a life sentence of being the world's emotional anchor. Inside the Oval Office, the silence is different. It is a thick, pressurized stillness. Every decision made at the resolute desk carries a body count or a breadline. While the media analyzed his rhetoric, Obama was often navigating the bittersweet loss of his own private life. In the bottom drawer of that desk, there were mental notes, letters never sent, words never spoken. They were apologies to his daughters, Malia and Sasha, for the missed dinners and the birthdays celebrated through a security detail. Power is a cruel merchant. To secure the future of millions of children, he had to borrow from the childhood of his own. He was the father of a nation, but often a ghost in his own home. This is the duty versus choice archetype in its most painful form. He didn't choose to be distant. The duty demanded it. The legacy of Barack Obama is often measured in legislation. The Affordable Care Act, the recovery from the Great Recession, or the Paris Agreement. But the true story DNA of his journey lies in a quiet, paradoxical truth. Great change does not happen with a bang. It happens through the slow, invisible erosion of old prejudices. He learned that being a leader isn't about the grand speeches that echo in history books. It's about the silent sacrifices made in the dead of night. He wasn't just a president, he was a catalyst. He changed the way a young child of color looks into a mirror and believes they can hold the steering wheel of destiny. The tragedy and the beauty of his journey are one and the same. He carried the world so that we wouldn't have to. He stood in the cold wind of solitude so that a new generation could feel the warmth of possibility. As he walked away from the White House for the last time in 2017, he didn't just leave behind a list of accomplishments. He left behind a lesson for us all. Do not look for perfect saviors. Look for courageous humans who are willing to carry the heavy, imperfect hopes of a broken world, even when their own shoulders are screaming for rest. In the end, Barack Obama's story is a reminder that the most profound victories aren't found in the noise of the crowd, but in the strength it takes to remain standing when the cheering stops and you are finally, truly alone. The calendar on the wall marked a date that once seemed a lifetime away, but now it had arrived with the stealthy coldness of a winter dawn. It was the final day. For 8 years, the White House had been a fortress of noise. The frantic clicking of camera shutters, the rhythmic thud of Marine One's blades, the heated debates of the Situation Room, and the constant, buzzing hum of history being manufactured in real time. But on this morning, the mansion had fallen into an alien, heavy stillness. Inside the Oval Office, the silence was absolute. It was not the peaceful silence of a library or the restful quiet of a bedroom. It was a pressurized, haunting void. As Barack Obama stood in the center of the room, he realized a truth that no textbook could ever convey. Power has no sound. We often mistake power for the roar of a crowd or the thunder of a gavel. We associate it with the booming voice of a leader at a podium. But in the end, when the applause dies down and the aides have whispered their final briefings, power reveals its true form, a bone-chilling quiet. It is the silence of responsibility, the weight of decisions that cannot be undone, and the haunting realization that the desk you are leaving will soon be occupied by someone who may dismantle everything you built. Obama began the ritual of the exit, gathering the final few personal items that had turned this museum-like office into a home. A small bust of Martin Luther King Jr., a few framed family photos, a carved wooden bird. Each object felt heavier than it had 8 years ago, as if they had absorbed the gravity of the events they witnessed. As he placed a photo of Michelle and the girls into a cardboard box, his mind drifted back to the lecture halls of Harvard. He remembered the young, ambitious version of himself, the law student who viewed power as a tool of assertion. Back then, he believed that to lead was to speak, to convince, to command the room with the sheer force of intellect and rhetoric. He saw power as a proactive flame, a way to declare to the world, "I am here, and this is the path we shall take." But 8 years at the resolute desk had shattered that youthful illusion. Power, he now understood, was not about assertion. It was about endurance. To lead was to become a shock absorber for a nation's anxieties. It was the ability to sit in this very room while the global economy crumbled in 2009 and remain the calmest person in the building. It was the stamina to endure the biting criticism that questioned his very right to be there, his birth, his faith, his intentions. In the hallowed halls of academia, he had been taught to win arguments. In the Oval Office, he had been taught to survive them. He looked at the floor, at the rug he had designed with the quotes of his predecessors woven into the border. He thought about the thousands of times he had raised his hand to speak, whether in a cabinet meeting or a televised address. For him, a man of his background, every gesture was laden with a double meaning. Every time he spoke, it wasn't just a policy answer or a political stance. It was a defiant affirmation of existence against a persistent tide of skepticism. Being the first meant that he never had the luxury of being just a president. He was a symbol, a target, and a test. Every word had to be measured, every emotion checked, because the margin for error for a man like him was non-existent. Power was the quiet strength required to mask the exhaustion, to suppress the anger, and to keep moving forward when the path was blocked by the brick walls of partisanship. The sunlight shifted, casting long, skeletal shadows across the wooden floor. This was the room where he had authorized the raid on Abbottabad, where he had wept after the tragedy at Sandy Hook, and where he had celebrated the passage of laws that brought healthcare to millions. The walls were saturated with those memories, but they remained stubbornly mute. He took one last look at the empty desk. The transition was almost complete. The cardboard box was taped shut. In a few hours, a new family would move in. A new ego would fill the space, and the silence he was leaving behind would be shattered by the arrival of the next era. As he turned to walk out the door for the final time, he realized that he wasn't just leaving a building. He was shedding a skin. The weight of the world was finally lifting from his shoulders, leaving a strange, light sensation that felt almost like a loss. He had endured. He had survived the silence, and as the door clicked shut behind him, the echo of that final sound was the only thing that remained in the stillness of the Oval Office. The sun-drenched beaches of Hawaii, with their rhythmic tides and carefree atmosphere, should have been the backdrop for a simple childhood. But for young Barack, the island was not just a playground. It was a labyrinth of mirrors. He did not grow up nurturing the grandiose ambition of one day standing behind a podium in the nation's capital to be sworn in as president. He didn't dream of motorcades or world summits. Instead, his childhood was occupied by a much more visceral, much more haunting pursuit: the search for a reflection that made sense. He grew up not with a map of his future, but with a persistent, nagging question that echoed through every stage of his youth. Who am I? To understand the man, one must understand the isolation of the boy. Raised in a household that was a mosaic of missing pieces, a Kenyan father who was a shadow in letters, and a white mother who lived between cultures, Barack was a bridge built before there was even a river to cross. He was a child of the in-between, navigating a world that demanded he choose a side, even when his very DNA refused to comply. Before he ever understood the political complexities of a nation, he had to master the emotional complexity of a broken home. He learned to carry the weight of a fragmented family tree long before he understood the true meaning of the word family. But the true weight began to settle when the world decided that he was no longer just a man, but a symbol. There is a peculiar, often crushing tax levied upon those who are the first. When you are the first to break a barrier, you are stripped of the luxury of individuality. You no longer represent your own successes or your own failures. You become the vessel for the aspirations, the fears, and the dignity of an entire race. In this state of existence, a person ceases to be flesh and blood and becomes a monument. The world looks at you and expects perfection, not because they believe you are perfect, but because they need you to be. Every scratch on your character, every stutter in your speech, every mistake in your judgment is not seen as a human error. It is interpreted as a crack in the very ideal of the people you represent. If you falter, the critics don't just say he failed, they say they failed. Young Barack learned this lesson in the silent spaces of his youth. He saw the skepticism in the eyes of strangers and the immense, almost desperate hope in the eyes of those who looked like him. He understood that his life was a high-stakes performance, where the audience was the entire world. To survive, he had to develop a skin that was both thick enough to deflect the arrows of prejudice and sensitive enough to feel the pulse of a grieving nation. He became an expert at carrying imperfect hopes. Hope is a beautiful word when shouted in a crowd, but it is a heavy burden when carried in private. The millions of people who looked at him didn't just see a politician. They saw their own dreams of justice, their own desires for a seat at the table, and their own prayers for a better life for their children. They handed him their unrefined, messy, and often contradictory expectations, and he had to find a way to weave them into a single, coherent narrative of progress. Imagine the psychological toll of being a guardian of a million different dreams while you are still trying to find the pieces of your own heart. While other children were learning the simple dynamics of a dinner table, Barack was learning the geopolitics of identity. He was studying the architecture of belonging. He was discovering that for someone like him, home wasn't a place you were born into. It was a place you had to build, brick by brick, out of your own courage and intellect. As he moved from the islands of Hawaii to the streets of Chicago and eventually to the corridors of Washington, he took those cracks with him. He didn't hide them. He wore them as a testament to the fact that you can be broken and still be beautiful. He proved that an imperfect man, a man with a missing father, a confusing heritage, and a restless soul, could still be the anchor for a perfect ideal. The story of Barack Obama is not the story of a man who found himself and then changed the world. It is the story of a man who agreed to represent the world's hope, even while he was still searching for himself. It is the story of the first who realized that his greatest contribution wasn't his policies or his laws, but his willingness to stand in the gap, to take the hits, and to show everyone that the cracks in the monument don't mean the structure is falling. They mean the light is finally getting in. November 4th, 2008. The air in Grant Park, Chicago, was not merely cold. It was electric, charged with the kinetic energy of millions of souls suspended in a moment of historical vertigo. Outside, the world was a cacophony of euphoria. A sea of people, weeping and cheering, chanted three words that had transformed from a campaign slogan into a global prayer. Yes, we can. The sound was deafening, a sonic tidal wave that threatened to shake the very foundations of the city. But just a few feet away, separated from the madness by a thin, heavy velvet curtain, there existed a pocket of absolute, terrifying silence. In the shadows of the wings, Barack Obama stood alone. The bright lights of the stage bled through the edges of the fabric, casting long, dramatic streaks across his face. But he remained in the dark. In that sliver of time, before the world claimed him, he did something purely human. He took a deep, shuddering breath. A high-contrast silhouette of a man behind a stage curtain, bright light leaking through the edges. It was a breath intended to steady a racing heart, but as the oxygen filled his lungs, it didn't bring relief. Instead, it brought the first true taste of his new reality. In that exhale, the glory of the victory, the delegates won, the maps turned blue, the speeches delivered, evaporated. What remained in its place was a weight so immense it felt tectonic. It was the weight of two wars, a global financial system on the brink of collapse, and the desperate, hungry expectations of a planet that had decided he was a secular messiah. In that midnight shade, Obama came to a profound and painful realization. From this second forward, he was no longer a person. He had been stripped of the most fundamental human right, the right to be ordinary. To be ordinary is to have the permission to fail, to be messy, to be uncertain, and to be wrong. But for the 44th President of the United States, that permission had been revoked. The world had just handed him a crown of historic proportions, but the cost of that crown was the total surrender of his right to be weak. A golden crown resting on a heavy, dark stone pedestal, surrounded by stormy clouds. Think of the psychological geometry of that moment. When a man becomes a symbol, he is no longer allowed to have a bad day. He cannot show fear, for fear would trigger a global panic. He cannot show anger, for anger would be used to confirm the worst stereotypes of his detractors. He cannot even show grief without it being analyzed for political theater. He had become a statue of himself, a vessel for the hopes of others, leaving very little room for the man named Barack. As he adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, he knew that the "Yes, we can" chanting outside was a double-edged sword. It was an anthem of empowerment for the people, but for him, it was a relentless demand. It meant, you must fix our broken homes. You must heal our racial wounds. You must stop the rising oceans. You must be the answer to every question we have ever been afraid to ask. The crown was not made of gold. It was made of lead and light. It was the triumphant victory of the story DNA. But it was also the beginning of the bittersweet loss. He was winning the highest office in the land, but he was losing the privacy of his soul. The linear growth of his journey, from the community organizer in Chicago to the senator in D.C., had reached its zenith, and the view from the top was breathtakingly lonely. He understood that the people shouting his name weren't just cheering for a politician. They were cheering for a miracle, and he knew, perhaps better than anyone else, that he was just a man who got tired, a man who had doubts, a man who was now forbidden from showing either. The stage manager whispered a cue. The music swelled, a triumphant, soaring score designed to make the heart skip a beat. Obama straightened his back, a motion that was less about pride and more about bracing for a collision. He put on the presidential mask, the calm, resolute, and steady expression that would define his public persona for the next 2,920 days. He stepped out from the shadows and into the blinding white light of history. The roar of the crowd hit him like a physical force, a wall of sound that would have knocked a lesser man down. He smiled, he waved, and he spoke of the long road ahead. But as he looked out at the thousands of faces in Grant Park, a part of him remained back in the shadows of the wings, holding that one deep breath, knowing that for the next 8 years, he would never truly be allowed to let it out. The world had gifted him a legacy, but it had taken his humanity as collateral. He was now the leader of the free world, but he was also a prisoner of his own greatness. Deep within the heavy, oak-carved frame of the resolute desk, a piece of furniture crafted from the timbers of a British Arctic exploration ship, lies more than just top-secret briefings and executive orders. In the shadows of its drawers, among the clutter of pens and official seals, there exists an invisible ledger. It is a record of a father's private grief, containing words that were never read aloud, sentences that never found their way into a teleprompter, and apologies that remained frozen in the ink of a fountain pen. These were the unuttered cries of a man named Barack, directed toward 2 girls named Malia and Sasha. To the world, the resolute desk is the ultimate altar of global authority, but for the man sitting behind it, it often felt like a barrier between him and the life he cherished most. Power, in its most honest form, is a cruel and relentless exchange. It operates on a chilling arithmetic. To secure the future of millions of children across the globe, to ensure their health care, their education, and their safety, Obama had to repeatedly borrow from the childhood of his own daughters. He was a man building a house for the world, while the walls of his own family's privacy were being systematically dismantled. Imagine the quiet heartbreak of a Tuesday evening in the West Wing. While the president is debating the nuances of a drone strike or the complexities of a healthcare mandate, a few floors above him in the residence, a math project is being completed without his help. A bedtime story is being read by a mother who has to explain once again why Daddy is busy saving the world. For Malia and Sasha, the President of the United States wasn't a historical figure. He was a father who was often a ghost in his own hallway, a man whose presence was frequently mediated by Secret Service agents and the pressing demands of the 24-hour news cycle. Obama understood, with a piercing clarity, that he was trading the irreplaceable for the essential. He was trading the smell of his daughter's hair and the sound of their laughter at the dinner table for the chance to pass a law that might one day help a child in a rural village he would never visit. This is the sacrifice mechanism of his story DNA in its most raw state. He was the father of the nation, a title that carries immense prestige, but it is a title that often demands the abdication of the simple, joyful role of being just a dad. The tragedy of this exchange is that the debt is non-transferable and, ultimately, unpayable. There is no executive order that can restore a missed 10th birthday. There is no act of Congress that can bring back the quiet weekends of a normal childhood that were sacrificed at the altar of national security. No matter how many millions of people were lifted out of poverty, or how many lives were saved by his policies, that private ledger of absence remained in the red. These are the debts that can never be repaid by any law, no matter how historic or sweeping. In those late-night hours, when the West Wing grew quiet and the only sound was the scratch of his pen against paper, Obama lived in the bittersweet loss of his success. He was the most powerful man on earth, yet he was powerless to stop the clock from ticking away the years of his daughter's youth. He was a man who could command armies, but he couldn't command a single afternoon of total, uninterrupted privacy with his family. The apologies hidden in the resolute desk were a testament to this struggle. They were the story DNA of a man who refused to let his soul be completely swallowed by his office. By writing down what he couldn't say, he was trying to preserve a piece of his humanity. He was acknowledging that while the world saw a leader of steel, his heart was still that of a father who felt the sting of every missed recital and every forgotten inside joke. As Malia and Sasha grew up under the relentless glare of the spotlight, their father watched them with a mixture of pride and profound regret. He saw them navigate the trap of the symbol, alongside him, losing their anonymity so that he could fulfill his destiny. He knew that their resilience was not something they chose, but something that was thrust upon them. When the 2017 transition finally came and the boxes were packed, the resolute desk remained. The new occupant would bring their own pens, their own photos, and their own burdens. But for Obama, leaving that desk wasn't just about the end of a presidency. It was about the beginning of a long journey to settle the debt. It was the moment he could finally stop borrowing from the future and start living in the present. He left the Vungmien, crown, behind, finally reclaiming the right to be a father, a role that, in the quietest depths of his heart, always mattered more than being the leader of the free world. We often imagine change as a thunderclap, a sudden, violent eruption that alters the landscape in a single, dramatic moment. We look for the explosion, the grand revolution, or the overnight transformation that marks the end of one era and the beginning of another. But as the dust settles on the 2 terms of the 44th President of the United States, we are forced to confront a much deeper, more persistent truth. Real change, the kind that alters the soul of a nation, does not behave like a bomb. Instead, Change is the slow, relentless erosion of water against stone. It is the patient dripping of persistence onto the granite of prejudice. It is the steady flow of hope against the jagged cliffs of cynicism. For 8 years, Barack Obama did not just govern. He acted as a constant current, wearing away the edges of what the world once deemed impossible. A powerful river carving a deep canyon through ancient, dark rock. There is a profound paradox at the heart of leadership. The greatest changes usually occur in total silence. While the media clamors for headlines and the pundits debate the loud, visible clashes of policy, the true shifts are happening in the quiet corners of the human heart. Obama's legacy is often quantified by the ink on a page. The Affordable Care Act, the recovery from a global financial collapse, the climate accords. But these are merely the surface ripples. The deep-sea current of his impact lies in something much more intangible: the restoration of belief. He did not just leave behind a stack of legislation. He left behind a new reflection in the mirror for millions of children who had never seen someone like themselves in the highest seat of power. For a young black boy in Chicago, a girl in a rural village in Kenya, or a student of color at an elite university, the Obama effect wasn't a political argument. It was a psychological revolution. He gave them the permission to dream without borders. He proved that their heritage was not a barrier to be overcome, but a foundation to be built upon. The lesson we must draw from his journey is a sobering one. Do not look for perfect saviors. In our modern world, we are obsessed with the idea of the flawless hero, the leader without a shadow, the icon without a crack. But perfection is a myth that prevents us from taking action. Obama was not a perfect man, nor was he a perfect president. He was a human being who faced impossible choices, made painful compromises, and carried the weight of a million contradictory expectations. The true definition of courage, as seen through his eyes, is not the absence of fatigue or the absence of doubt. It is the audacity to carry the weight of hope even when your shoulders are screaming for rest. It is the willingness to stand in the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. Knowing that you may never reach the promised land yourself, he showed us that leadership is not about being the loudest voice in the room, but about being the most resilient one. He taught us that hope is not a feeling, it is a discipline. It is the choice to remain calm when the storm is at its peak. It is the choice to speak of unity when the air is thick with division. It is the sacrifice of the self for the sake of the collective identity. By the time he walked out of the White House for the last time, his hair was gray, his face was lined with the geography of 8 years of crisis, and his stride was perhaps a little slower. But the water had done its work. The stone had been shaped. As we reflect on this journey, we are forced to redefine our own understanding of what it means to win. Is success the roar of the crowd? Or is it the quiet knowledge that you have made the path a little smoother for the person coming behind you? Is it the power you wield, or the empowerment you leave behind? Barack Obama's story is a mirror held up to our own potential. It asks us, are you willing to be the water? Are you willing to persist when the stone seems unyielding? Are you brave enough to carry a heavy hope in a world that often prefers the ease of despair? Power is fleeting, but influence is eternal. Obama's journey from the question of, who am I, to the statement of, yes, we can, is a roadmap for anyone who feels like an outsider. It is a reminder that the most significant work of your life might be done in the silence of your own persistence. Which lesson from Obama's journey has most significantly shifted your perspective on success? Was it the value of silent endurance? The cost of being the first? or the realization that even leaders have debts to their families? Please share your thoughts in the comments below.